The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, casting that particular shade of blue that made 2:38 a.m. feel eternal. Hannah Clarke moved through St. Michael's Hospital ICU with the kind of quiet that comes from people who have learned to disappear. She adjusted the 4-drip on Bay 14, sodium chloride, run rate precise, her hands moving with the economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Beep. 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 She didn't need to look at them anymore. Her body knew the language of machines keeping people alive. 8 years. 8 years of night shifts, of avoiding day rounds, of keeping her head down so far that most staff didn't know her name. They knew her presence, the quiet competence that meant if you were sick at 3 in the morning, Hannah Clarke was the nurse who would catch what everyone else missed. But they didn't know her. Nobody knew her. That was the point. Her scrubs fit like camouflage. They were meant to. The scar along her right forearm, usually hidden by sleeves, caught the light when she reached across the monitor stand to check the oxygen saturation sensor. The younger nurses sometimes stared at it. She never offered explanation. When they asked, she said accident and moved on. The accident had happened in a wadi outside Marja, but they didn't need to know that. Nobody needed to know anything about Hannah Clarke except that she showed up on time, kept her patients alive, and never asked for anything. In her locker, behind 3 pairs of spare scrubs and a regulation-issue cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender detergent, sat a pair of combat boots. Desert tan. Laces frayed at the ends. The leather was cracked along the toe box from heat and time and the particular way that dust gets into everything you own in Afghanistan and never quite leaves. She had worn those boots through Helmand Province, through 3 deployments, through the kind of moments you don't talk about because the records have been erased. The boots were the only physical proof that she had ever been anything other than a night shift nurse in Portland, Oregon. The supply room smelled like bleach and plastic packaging. She stood there sometimes during her breaks, just to hold the boots in her hands. Not to wear them. Just to know they were real. That she was real. That the woman who had carried David Brennan 3 miles through enemy fire, the woman who had called in medevacs with her bare hands caked in blood, the woman who had been a Master Chief Petty Officer in the Navy SEALs, that woman still existed somewhere underneath the scrubs and the low voice and the way she always let doctors talk over her. Sergeant Marcus Brennan arrived by ambulance at 4:15 a.m. Blunt force trauma from a training accident. Internal bleeding. The paramedics had him on 2 large bore 4s, the bag of saline running wide open, his blood pressure dropping like a stone. Hannah saw the intake board update and something in her chest moved, a recognition that had nothing to do with the name. Brennan was David's commanding officer. David had mentioned him once in a video call 6 months ago. Solid officer, runs a tight unit, used to be enlisted, knows what he's asking his people to do. That kind of officer. The kind you could respect. She filed a request to take his case before she could talk herself out of it. The charge nurse raised an eyebrow. You sure? He's going to need intensive monitoring. Hannah nodded. She was always sure. Being sure was what she did. Being sure was what kept people alive. Brennan was still conscious when they wheeled him in, his face grey with pain, his breathing shallow. Hannah hung 2 more units of O-negative while the trauma attending ran through the assessment. She worked with the focused precision of someone running a checklist, monitors, telemetry, Foley catheter, NPO status pending surgery. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory. Not medical school muscle memory. Older than that. The kind that lived in her bones from places that officially never happened. You on this one, Clarke? The trauma attending, Dr. Morrison, newer, actually competent, was checking her name on the board. Yes, doctor. Her voice was soft. It was always soft now. Like something she had learned to keep small. Good. I want him on high alert status. Watch for any sign of expansion. Anything changes, I want to know immediately. He moved on to the next bay. She made a note in the chart. Vitals every 15 minutes for the first hour, then every 30. blood work on a rolling protocol. She would watch him the way she had been trained to watch people, like their life was the only thing that mattered in the world. Which it was. That was the job. Dr. Caldwell appeared around 5:44 a.m., his footsteps announcing him before his presence did. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch was a Rolex. He wore his arrogance the way other people wore cologne. Hannah had been at St. Michael's long enough to understand the structure of power. Caldwell had the kind that came from money and connections and the particular certainty that the world was arranged exactly the way he deserved it to be. He had been a surgeon once, maybe, but now he was mostly administrator. He approved protocols. He approved billing codes. He had somehow become the person you answered to without anyone ever explicitly explaining why. He was reviewing charts in the central station when she came to update the medication administration record for Bay 12. She kept her head down. This was the rule: keep your head down, do your work, disappear back into the shift. But Caldwell looked up. He always looked up. He was the kind of person who noticed when he was being ignored. Clarke. Not a question. A statement. She looked up. Her jaw was level. Her eyes were clear. She had learned how to show nothing on her face a long time ago. Dr. Caldwell. Your patient in Bay 14. Brennan. He was holding the chart. I see you've ordered quite a lot of additional testing. Seems excessive for a straightforward trauma case. The patient's blood pressure is unstable, Hannah said. Her voice was measured. There's indication of ongoing internal bleeding. I want to establish a baseline for. Your job is to monitor vitals and change bedpans, Clarke. Not to make diagnostic decisions. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that was meant to be kind but tasted like poison. You have an associate degree, yes? Not a medical degree. That's correct, doctor. Then perhaps we should stick to what you're trained for. She said nothing. Saying nothing was also a skill. Saying nothing meant he didn't get the satisfaction of reaction. Saying nothing meant she kept her job and kept her head down and kept existing in this particular way. He closed the chart. I noticed some duplicate charges on his pre-op billing. Surgical equipment listed twice. That seems like sloppy documentation. He was watching her face. I don't suppose you'd know anything about that. I documented what I observed, doctor. The equipment was present twice in the operative field setup. Or perhaps the documentation is simply inaccurate. The smile widened. These things happen when people without proper training try to interpret hospital procedures. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The ventilator in Bay 14 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Hannah stood very still. This was the moment where someone with something to lose would flinch. Someone who cared about her reputation or her standing or how people perceived her would flinch. She was good at not flinching. But that wasn't the worst part. Caldwell set the chart on the desk and turned to leave, then stopped. He seemed to remember something. There's also the matter of the supply order discrepancies. You've been questioning several of the contracted vendors for the ICU stock, haven't you? I've been trying to ensure we're receiving what we're billing for, doctor. That's not your role. His voice was different now. Colder. You notice that pattern? What happens when people who don't belong in administrative decisions start making them? He turned back to face her completely, and now she could see it, the real thing underneath the professional tone. You keep that up, and I'll have security escort you out of the building. I'm not joking, Clarke. This is harassment, and I won't tolerate it. She nodded. One small, controlled movement. Understood, doctor. He left. His footsteps clicked across the tile floor, arrogant and assured. She went back to her charts. She checked Brennan's vitals. She hung the new bag of fluids with hands that were absolutely steady. She didn't let anything show on her face because there was nothing to show. This was something she had learned a very long time ago. Power was knowing how to wait. Her break was at 6:15 a.m. She spent it in the supply room, hands gripping the metal shelf until her knuckles went white. The shelf was cold. Industrial steel. The kind of thing that didn't care about anything. Around her were boxes of gauze and tape and floor supplies and everything you needed to keep people alive. She stared at the bottom shelf where her locker was, where the boots were waiting in the dark. Combat boots. Desert tan. Laces frayed at the ends. The leather was cracked from heat and from time and from walking through places where nobody was supposed to survive. The scar tissue on her chest, under the scrubs, under the soft voice, under 8 years of disappearing, it all corresponded to a rank that didn't exist anymore. A woman who had carried David Brennan 3 miles through enemy fire. A woman who had been a Master Chief Petty Officer. That woman was still in there. She could feel her sometimes. In moments like this, when she gripped the shelf hard enough to hurt, the woman who had been trained to kill and trained to save lives and trained to keep moving no matter what came next, that woman was very close to the surface. She released her grip. Her hands fell to her sides. She went back to work. The grand rounds begin at 7:15 in the morning. 12 residents crowd into ICU Bay 14, their white coats creating a wall of fresh-pressed cotton and institutional hierarchy. Army Sergeant Marcus Brennan lies in the center of their attention, machines breathing for him in steady mechanical rhythm, and Dr. Caldwell holds up Hannah's chart documentation like it's evidence at a crime scene. His voice carries across the unit with the precision of a man accustomed to being listened to. "This is what dangerously minimalist care looks like," Caldwell says, tapping the page with one finger. Nurse Clarke here apparently believes that 3-word assessments constitute adequate post-operative documentation. He reads her notes aloud, his tone dripping with manufactured concern. Patient stable. Vitals normal. No acute distress. He pauses, letting the words hang in the air like indictment. As if the residents here need to understand what those terms mean for someone with internal injuries of this magnitude. 2 of the younger residents actually smirk. One woman's eyes dart toward Hannah, assessing her reaction like she's watching a performance. Hannah stands with her hands clasped at her waist, positioned 3 feet from Caldwell, her face the color of hospital walls. Her jaw tightens, just barely, a movement no one in the group would catch unless they knew where to look. She maintains eye contact with the wall behind him, absorbing each word in silence, her shoulders neither rising nor falling with the rhythm of her breathing. Her expression shows nothing. No flush. No tremor. No retreat. What she's thinking, this man is committing fraud. That chart matters because billing codes matter, because the equipment he ordered doesn't match the equipment used, and someone is routing money through channels that don't exist for procedures that don't match the documentation. But none of that surfaces on her face. She simply absorbs the humiliation like she's been trained to absorb incoming fire, acknowledge it, catalog it, continue the mission. Caldwell continues for another 3 minutes, using her documentation as a teaching moment about the dangers of inadequate nursing notes. The residents nod. One of them, a surgical resident named Cho who'd been kind to Hannah last week, suddenly becomes very interested in his own shoes. When the rounds finally move to the next bay, the group disperses like water around a stone. Hannah doesn't move for 30 seconds. Then she returns to her charting station, pulls up Sergeant Brennan's billing record on the hospital system, and begins a methodical review of the surgical equipment charges. There it is. A charge for a 4.0 polypropylene suture kit dated the same day as another identical charge. 2 entries. Same procedure. Same unit. Same patient. Both approved by Dr. Caldwell. The afternoon shift arrives at 3 o'clock. Hannah finds herself in the break room near the vending machine at 3:47, standing in the space between fluorescent lights and the hum of the refrigerator, when Caldwell appears like he was summoned by her thoughts. He's loosening his tie, preparing for his exit from the day shift, his expression the comfortable ease of a man with nothing to fear. "Dr. Caldwell," she says. Her voice is level. There's a duplicate charge on Sergeant Brennan's file. Surgical equipment billed twice for the same procedure on the same date. I wanted to flag it with you before sending it to billing compliance. He turned slowly. His eyes move across her face like he's reading something written in a language he doesn't speak. Then he laughs. It's a genuine laugh, warm and amused, loud enough to draw the attention of two orderlies sorting supplies 3 feet away. "Nurse Clarke," he says, and his voice carries the tone of a man speaking to someone who's just asked him for advanced calculus when they haven't finished basic arithmetic. "Or should I call you a Detective Clarke? Maybe stick to bedpans and let the educated people handle hospital finance. Someone with just an associate degree shouldn't pretend to understand billing codes." His smile is condescending. It's the smile of someone watching a child attempt to fix a carburetor. One of the orderlies actually chuckles. Hannah's hands remain steady at her sides. She doesn't feel the urge to explain. She doesn't feel the urge to cry. What she feels is the memory of processing intelligence in a forward operating base outside Marja, cross-referencing supply manifests with casualty reports while rounds of incoming fire hammered against the concrete walls. That was 19 years ago. This is just vending machine theater. "I understand," Hannah says. 2 words. A masterclass in restraint. She turns and walks back to her unit. The combat boots in her locker suddenly feel very heavy, even though they're sitting 800 miles away in a storage unit. That evening at 6:40, Hannah is checking medication orders when she notices another billing anomaly. A duplicate charge for surgical gauze pads. This one approved 3 days after Brennan's procedure. She makes a note on her personal tablet, not on the hospital system, somewhere private, and crosses the unit to find Caldwell in his office reviewing charts. The door is open. She knocks on the frame. "Dr. Caldwell, I found another billing discrepancy. Same equipment category, different lot number, but the surgery notes don't indicate." His chair swivels toward her with the speed of a turret rotating. His face has changed. The amusement is gone. What remains is something colder, more calculating. A man who suddenly understood that a nurse examining his paperwork isn't a minor irritation, she's a threat. "If you keep harassing me about paperwork, I'll have security escort you out of this hospital. Do you understand me, Clarke?" His voice doesn't raise. That's the dangerous part. It gets quieter. "You're a night shift nurse with barely any credentials. Stay in your lane. Do your job. Stop asking questions that aren't your responsibility." "I'm documenting what I observe," Hannah says. Her voice is still level. Still composed. Still wrong. Patient safety requires accurate billing records, and these charges don't. That's not your responsibility. His eyes are hard now. That's administrative. That's finance. That's completely outside your scope of practice. You document clinical observations. You don't audit hospital billing. He stands up, his body language shifting toward the door, already dismissing her. "We're done here. And if I hear about any more questions regarding hospital finance from you, I'm filing a formal complaint about scope creep with your nursing supervisor." Hannah nods once. A single downward movement of her head that could mean agreement or could mean acknowledgement. She returns to her rounds without speaking. The night shift begins at 11. Hannah works Bay 14, monitoring Sergeant Brennan's post-operative recovery, checking his dressings, managing his pain protocol, watching the monitors track his heart and lungs and oxygen saturation. He's stable. The charts reflect stability. The numbers say he's healing correctly. But Hannah has spent 23 years in environments where numbers lie, where what the instruments say and what's actually happening exist in different countries with different languages. At 11:30, she's in the supply room, the same supply room where she keeps her boots hidden in a locker she pays personally to rent, a space that smells like antiseptic and old bleach and the particular chemical perfume of medical equipment that's been sterilized 100 times. She grips the edge of a metal shelf. Her knuckles turn white. She stares at the locker across the room, the one with her name on it in faded lettering, and feels the weight of 8 years pressing down on her shoulders like a rucksack filled with stones. The boots are in there. Just leather and laces now, worn thin at the heel, split along the right sole, the left one stained with what might be dust from Helm and Provence or might be something no one should catalogue. They're the only physical proof that she ever was anyone other than Hannah Clarke, night shift nurse, associate degree, nobody important, person who doesn't understand hospital finance. She lets go of the shelf. Her hands fall to her sides. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. It's the kind of trembling that comes from holding something in, pressing something down, keeping something locked so tightly that your hands physically shake from the pressure. She goes back to work. The monitors in Bay 14 show Sergeant Brennan's vitals stable. The machines breathe for him in their mechanical rhythm. The 4 lines deliver their medications on schedule. The dressings remain dry. Everything is as it should be. Everything is exactly as the charts say it should be. Hannah watches him sleep, and somewhere in her mind that exists in a place this hospital doesn't have access to, she calculates probabilities. She calculates what incomplete billing records might suggest about procedure accuracy. She calculates what a man with something to hide does when he realizes someone is looking too closely at what he's hiding. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next changed the entire trajectory of Sergeant Brennan's recovery. The monitors shrieked at 6:23 a.m. Not the usual alert tone, the code blue shriek, the one that makes every nurse's spine straighten. Hannah was 40 feet away at the medication cart when the sound hit, and she didn't need to look. She knew that bay. She knew that patient. Sergeant Marcus Brennan's chest incision had ruptured internally, blood pressure plummeting from 118 systolic to 71 in the span of 30 seconds. The new resident, a third year whose name Hannah could never quite remember, stood frozen beside the bed, and hovering over the call button as if the physical act of pressing it required permission from someone smarter. Hannah moved before conscious thought could catch up. 23 years of muscle memory doesn't ask for authorization. She was at the crash cart, hands already reaching, when the resident finally found her voice and called for help. Too late. The code team was for minutes out from the other end of the hospital. Sergeant Brennan had 90 seconds, perhaps less. His heart was bleeding into a space where it shouldn't be bleeding, pooling against the left ventricle, pressure building with every beat until the next beat wouldn't come. She didn't check the assignment board. She didn't wait for permission. She pushed past the frozen resident and grabbed a scalpel from the tray, its weight familiar in her hand like a tool returning to its owner after years of exile. The surgical blade caught the overhead lights as she approached the bed, and she could feel Dr. Caldwell's presence somewhere in the corridor. She heard his voice calling orders to someone, calling for a page, calling for backup, but he wasn't here. He wasn't looking at Sergeant Brennan's monitors. He wasn't watching the oxygen saturation drop from 89 to 82 to 74. Hannah reopened the chest incision without anesthesia, without sterile field, without the 7-step verification protocol that every nursing textbook demanded. The incision split open with a wet sound like tearing silk, and blood, so much blood, spilled across the surgical drapes and her gloved hands and the front of her scrubs. Her vision narrowed to the space between the ribs, to the pale tissue beneath, to the heart that should have been pumping strength but was instead drowning in its own fluid. She reached into the chest cavity. Her bare hand. Her palm against Sergeant Brennan's left ventricle. The muscle was cold and flaccid beneath her skin, and she began the compressions, not the external chest compressions that CPR demanded, but direct cardiac massage, the kind of intimate, primal intervention that only existed in trauma bays and forward operating bases where protocol died the moment shock arrived. Her fingers moved with precision that came from holding together the shattered chests of Marines in Marja, from the operating tent at FOB Shank where the generator hummed and the night was thick with the sound of rotors and dying. Pain is data. Pressure is communication. Blood is just volume that needs circulation. The resident was still frozen. Hannah didn't have time for gentleness. Clamp the bleeder. There, your left hand, don't think, just move. Her voice dropped an octave, the command structure of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The resident's hand shook as she reached for the forceps, but reached she did. Hannah guided her without looking away from the exposed heart beneath her fingers. Pressure on the aortic root, that's the only line holding his volume. Don't let off, don't hesitate, don't breathe wrong. The monitors climbed. 84. 86. 90. Sinus rhythm returned like a promise being kept. The heart beneath her hand strengthened, the rhythm establishing itself with the kind of authority that only comes when you're literally holding someone's life in your grip. Blood flow restored. Oxygen climbing. The thing inside his chest that made him Sergeant Marcus Brennan, that made him David's commanding officer, that made him the Marine who'd carried Hannah's own son 3 miles through IED-laden terrain, was beating. Still beating. The surgical team arrived at 6:27 a.m., 4 minutes into the crisis. They didn't ask questions. They saw the open chest, the exposed heart, the resident holding a clamp with white knuckles, and the woman in blood-soaked scrubs who moved out of the way with the fluid precision of someone trained to do exactly this. They took over. Hannah stepped back. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the kind of trembling that comes from maximum effort and sudden stillness, like a runner's legs after a sprint. She was breathing steady. Her mind was clear. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. That was when she saw Dr. Caldwell in the doorway. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching the surgical team work, watching the monitors climb to normal ranges, watching Sergeant Brennan's blood pressure stabilize at 127/84. His expression was unreadable, something between shock and calculation, the way a chess player looks at the board after an unexpected move. Then he turned and walked away. She heard the mechanical click of his phone, the soft beep of the unlocked screen. The first call came through at 6:31 a.m. She overheard a fragment of it through the open ICU doors. "I'm calling because one of my nursing staff just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure on a patient in my unit." No, not a surgeon. A nurse. An RN with only an associate degree, working without supervision or protocol authorization. She couldn't hear the response, but she could imagine it. The board president was probably awake now, coffee warming in his hands, listening to words like liability and credential violation and practicing medicine without a license. By 6:22 a.m., security had appeared at the ICU entrance. 2 officers in dark uniforms, radios clipped to their belts, the kind of polite authority that leaves no room for argument. Hannah was still in the bay, still covered in blood, still watching the surgical residents close the chest incision while Sergeant Brennan's monitors beat their steady rhythm. The security officers approached with the apologetic stiffness of people who'd been given orders they didn't particularly enjoy. "Ms. Clarke, we need you to step away from the patient." The officer's voice was kind, which somehow made it worse. Kindness carries heavier weight than cruelty. Hannah didn't argue. She stripped off her gloves, they made that distinctive snapping sound as they came free, the sound of something ending, and placed them in the biohazard container. She stepped back from the bed. Her badge was waiting at the nurse's station, and she knew without being told that she wouldn't be putting it back on her scrubs. Dr. Caldwell was there, speaking to the security supervisor with his phone still in his hand. He'd made at least 2 more calls while she'd been working. She could see the disciplinary reports on his desk, papers he'd been building toward this moment for weeks, and she understood then that this hadn't been improvisation. It had been preparation. Every small slight, every whispered comment about her degree and her experience and her presumption, had been documentation for exactly this moment. The escort through the hospital was silent. Rubber-soled boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The morning shift was arriving, and Hannah could feel eyes on her as she walked, the blood on her scrubs, the ID badge missing from her neck, the 2 security officers flanking her like she was a threat instead of someone who'd just kept a man alive. Her colleagues wouldn't meet her eyes. Some of them had seen her in Bay 14. Some of them had heard her voice calling instructions to the resident. Some of them understood exactly what had happened and exactly why she was walking out. Dr. Caldwell followed them to Human Resources. He carried a folder thick with papers, and he placed each one on the HR director's desk with the precision of a prosecutor laying out evidence. Disciplinary report dated 3 weeks prior, conduct unbecoming a healthcare professional. Another dated 2 weeks prior, failure to respect physician authority. Another from last week, inappropriate documentation and patient chart manipulation. Each one was dated and signed and completely fabricated, but the HR director was already pulling up her personnel file on the computer, and Hannah understood that her 8 years of invisibility was about to become 8 seconds of spectacle. "We'll need to conduct a full investigation," the HR director was saying. "Based on these reports and the incident this morning, we may need to contact the state board. Until then, your access is revoked. You're suspended pending investigation." Hannah's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "I understand." Dr. Caldwell smiled. He shouldn't have smiled. His expression carried the satisfied certainty of someone who'd just eliminated a problem, not realizing that the thing he'd eliminated was the only person in the hospital who understood exactly who he was and exactly what he'd been doing. But she didn't tell him that. She simply let the security officers escort her down to the basement level, through the garage, past the rows of employee parking where her 15-year-old Honda sat under fluorescent lights like a patient waiting for diagnosis. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off. Her hands were finally steady now, resting on the steering wheel. She couldn't lift her head. She couldn't process the weight of what had just happened, not the firing, not the accusations, not the fabricated reports that now existed in her personnel file like lies becoming truth through repetition. What crushed her was the silence that would follow. The invisibility that had protected her for 8 years had just become a prison. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain that she was Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, Navy SEAL medic, because those records were erased and surfacing them meant endangering the families of operators still in the field. She couldn't say she'd trained at the Naval Special Warfare Medical Institute. She couldn't explain that direct cardiac massage was the only procedure that could have kept Sergeant Brennan alive in that moment. She was just a nurse who'd overstepped. Just an associate degree holder who'd forgotten her place. Just someone who'd vanished into a hospital 8 years ago and would now vanish again, this time into unemployment and investigation and the kind of isolation that comes from being the person everyone agrees was wrong. The parking garage was empty at 8:14 a.m. Rain began to fall sometime around 8:30, drumming against her windshield with the sound of 1,000 tiny accusations. She sat there in the dark, engine off, knowing that her name was now in a state investigator's file, knowing that Dr. Caldwell had probably documented her suspension by noon, knowing that by this time tomorrow the entire hospital would know that the night shift nurse in the ICU had been removed for an authorized medical practice. But that wasn't what would change everything. That wasn't the moment that would matter. That moment was still coming. Security removed her from the ICU at 7:48 a.m. 2 officers, one with a name tag that said Martinez, the other with a jaw like granite, flanked her as she walked. Her scrubs were stiff with Brennan's blood. It had dried in the creases of her wrists, under her fingernails, in the seams where her sleeve met her glove. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm behind her as they escorted her down the corridor, past residents who stopped talking mid-sentence. Past nurses who looked away. Her ID badge was already gone, confiscated before her hands finished trembling, which they didn't, because Hannah Clarke's hands never trembled, not in public, not when every eye in the ICU was cataloguing her humiliation like it was part of the morning rounds. Dr. Caldwell appeared at the stairwell landing, his white coat immaculate, his expression carrying the satisfied weight of a man who had just won a game he'd been playing for months. He gestured for the security officers to step back. They did. Of course they did. Caldwell had that voice, the kind that made air pressure change in a room, the kind that came from knowing exactly which administrator's nephew he'd gotten into Yale, which board member's daughter he'd referred to the oncology fellowship. Institutional power worn like cologne. "Dr. Clarke," he said, and the title was a knife disguised as courtesy. "My office. HR is waiting." The walk to the administrative wing felt like moving through water. Each step was real, measurable, ticking down to something Hannah couldn't stop. The hospital smelled different on this floor, less antiseptic, more expensive. Leather chairs. Oak furniture. The kind of space where people made decisions about people like her. Caldwell walked 3 steps ahead, his pace unhurried, his shoulders loose. He wasn't worried. He'd already prepared everything. The HR director, Patricia Westbrook, sat behind a mahogany desk. She was mid-50s, the kind of woman who'd mastered the art of looking simultaneously sympathetic and certain. A manila folder lay open in front of her. Caldwell had brought an accordion file, 6 months of documentation, Hannah realized. Not created this morning. Built. Constructed. A narrative he'd been assembling since the moment she'd questioned the first billing code. "Please sit," Westbrook said. Hannah Saturday. Her scrub stuck to the leather chair. A small sound, barely audible, as she moved. Caldwell remained standing, positioned between her and the door like he was guarding something. Westbrook didn't waste time. "Ms. Clarke, on this morning at approximately 6:23 a.m., you performed an open cardiac massage on a patient, Sergeant Marcus Brennan, without physician authorization, without proper licensing, and without following established surgical protocols. Is that correct?" Hannah said nothing. In her peripheral vision, she could see Caldwell's fingers resting on the back of an empty chair. Relaxed. Confident. "You performed a thoracotomy," Westbrook continued, reading from the file. "You opened a patient's chest cavity, manually massaged the heart, and provided emergency cardiac intervention that is exclusively within the scope of physician practice. Do you understand why this is a problem?" One word would end this. One sentence explaining that she'd trained in field medicine across 4 combat zones, that she'd performed this exact procedure in tents without electricity, that she'd kept operators alive while explosions shook the canvas around her. One reference to her service record would explain everything. She couldn't say it. The Navy's erasure was absolute. 8 years ago, after Marja, after an operation that didn't exist for people who weren't supposed to exist, she'd signed documents, legal agreements with penalties that extended beyond law into something darker. Disappearance was mandatory. To resurface, to claim that rank, to reference that service meant compromising ongoing operations. Meant endangering the families of operators still deployed in classified positions. Meant breaking an oath that cut deeper than any civilian contract could touch. So she sat there, covered in another man's blood, and said nothing. Caldwell leaned forward. "There's more. I've compiled documentation of insubordination, of harassment regarding billing matters. You were explicitly warned to stop questioning hospital finances, and of a pattern of behavior inconsistent with nursing standards. Additionally, the State Medical Board will be receiving a complaint regarding your unauthorized practice of medicine." Westbrook removed her glasses. "I've been in this position for 18 years. I've never seen documentation this comprehensive. Dr. Caldwell has been very thorough." She looked directly at Hannah. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Hannah shook her head. "Once. Measured. Controlled. Your employment with St. Michael's is terminated effective immediately," Westbrook said. "You will surrender your hospital credentials, your access badges, and any keys you've been issued. Security will escort you from the building. The State Medical Board will likely initiate an investigation into your credentials and training. I recommend retaining an attorney." Caldwell smiled. "You'll never work as a nurse again. Not in Oregon. Not anywhere that does a background check." Hannah stood. Her legs worked. Her balance held. She'd been trained to move under pressure, to execute function when every nerve was screaming to shut down. She walked to the door. Caldwell stepped aside, not from respect, but because he'd already won. He didn't need to block her exit. The walk to the parking garage took 7 minutes. Hannah counted each one. Elevator to sublevel 3. The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps in the concrete space. Her car was a 2009 Honda Civic with 247,000 miles on the odometer and a battery that had been struggling for months. She'd kept it running because it was invisible, not worth stealing, not worth remembering, not worth a second glance. She sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. The engine wouldn't turn over. Of course it wouldn't. She turned the key again. Nothing. Just a clicking sound, weak, mechanical, defeated. The battery was dead. Completely, irreversibly dead, just like everything else. Her forehead came to rest on the steering wheel. 8 years of silence. 8 years of pushing a mop through hospital corridors at night, of sleeping for hours on a schedule that never synced to normal time, of keeping her head down so completely that she'd become part of the architecture, something people walked past without registering. 8 years of watching inferior nurses get promotions, of listening to doctors order procedures that violated basic trauma protocols, of keeping her mouth shut while she catalogued every mistake because speaking would expose who she was. She'd done it all to protect people she couldn't name, to maintain security clearances for operations that officially never occurred, to honor an oath that demanded her complete erasure. And she'd thrown it away in 6 seconds of panic. No. Not panic. Muscle memory. Combat instinct. Brennan's chest was open, actually open, not metaphorically, but physically ruptured, and her hands had moved on their own. She didn't think. Thinking was a luxury she'd surrendered 8 years ago. She'd assessed, she'd acted, she'd used every skill the Navy had spent for years teaching her, and now those same skills had cost her everything she'd rebuilt. Her hands rested in her lap. No trembling. The trembling wasn't happening, it was restraint, was the physical manifestation of control so tight it hurt. Somewhere in the hospital above her, Dr. Caldwell was probably heading back to the ICU, checking on his conquest, making sure Brennan was still alive and therefore bound to silence about how he'd actually survived. A dead patient would have prompted questions. A living one who owed his life to a woman Caldwell had just destroyed was simply grateful. The parking garage was silent except for the occasional rumble of a car moving between levels. Concrete pillars rose like the ribcage of something massive and dead. Morning light filtered through the gaps, creating stripes of brightness and shadow across her steering wheel. She didn't know that 3 floors above her, a news producer was sitting in the hospital lobby watching footage from a documentary project, footage showing a woman in desert camouflage with medals on her chest, a woman who was officially dead but whose face had been leaked to media outlets investigating forgotten veterans. She didn't know that Brennan had been conscious longer than anyone realized, that he'd heard her name when security came, that he was reaching for his phone to make a call. She didn't know that in exactly 48 minutes, everything would change. Right now, she just sat in the darkness of the parking garage, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, unable to lift her head, unable to move, unable to do anything except sit with the weight of invisibility that had finally crushed her after all these years of silence. The lobby television flickered to life at 11:53 a.m., and the news anchor's voice cut through the ambient hum of hospital machinery like a knife through silk. CNN. National broadcast. And there, across every screen mounted on the walls, Hannah's face. Her military portrait, the one from 2016, the one that was supposed to be erased from existence. The Chiron read, missing Navy combat medic identified after 8 years. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, presumed KIA in Marja, alive in Portland. She wasn't watching. She was standing in the parking lot arranging a tow truck for her dead Honda, still wearing blood-stained scrubs, when the hospital's assistant director found her and pressed a phone into her hand. "You need to see this," the woman whispered, and Hannah turned to watch her own ghost materialize across the lobby screens in high definition. The leaked photographs showed her in combat gear, in a tactical vest, in a Black Hawk helicopter, in moments that should have remained classified. Journalists had been investigating for months, missing SEAL medics, operators lost in theater, families never given closure. The story was human interest gold. And now it was breaking on every network simultaneously. The Pentagon had no comment. The Navy had no comment. But the photographs had 100,000 comments already accumulating across social media. Hannah didn't move. Didn't blink. Watched her own erasure being reversed in real time by strangers who had no idea what they were unraveling. What happened next unfolded in the boardroom where Dr. Caldwell was mid-sentence, explaining to the hospital board that the Clarke situation had been regrettable but necessary for patient safety standards. The door opened. Sergeant Brennan's son entered, a young Marine corporal, still in dress uniform, back from leave because his commanding officer had called to tell him his father had nearly died and someone had saved him. The corporal walked directly to the head of the conference table, looked Caldwell in the eyes, and spoke 3 words loud enough to stop breathing. "Valkyrie Actual's back." The board members exchanged blank stares. Caldwell's face went pale. Valkyrie Actual was a unit designation. Valkyrie Actual was not a nurse. Valkyrie Actual was something classified, something beyond civilian understanding, something that only people with level 5 clearance should even know existed. The corporal continued. "My father says his commanding officer carried my sister 3 miles through enemy fire after an IED strike in 2016. That was Marja. That was the mission where Hannah Clarke disappeared. My father says she's here. He says she saved his life. He says I need to tell you who she is before you destroy the wrong person." Before anyone could speak, the doors opened again. 2-star General Marcus Holloway entered with an aide carrying a folder stamped with red classification headers. The general was tall enough that he seemed to absorb light. He set the folder on the conference table with the kind of deliberate precision that made it seem like a weapon. "Gentlemen, you're in the presence of a decorated naval officer," the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. "Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. For combat deployments. 2 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star with Combat V for Valor. Silver Star for the Marja operation." He opened the folder with one hand, reading from documentation that had been locked in Pentagon archives for 8 years. "And pending final review, a Navy Cross for her actions this morning in your ICU." The boardroom door was still open. The veteran security guard who had escorted Hannah from the hospital that morning, a 63-year-old former Army MP with 30 years of service, was standing in the hallway. He went pale. His knees nearly buckled. Because he'd been close enough to her to see the calloused hands, the muscle memory, the way she moved with the kind of economy that only came from years of survival. He raised his voice across the threshold. "That's a Master Chief Petty Officer, sir. That's a Command Master Chief." The room went dead silent. Dr. Caldwell's attorney was already making phone calls. Caldwell himself was calculating the math of every conversation he'd had, every threat he'd made, every file he'd attempted to alter to discredit a woman whose service record made him seem not just incompetent but criminal. The hospital board president's face was the color of uncooked chicken. What they didn't know yet was that the FBI was already in the building. At 1:15 p.m., federal agents requested all billing records and personnel files related to ICU surgical procedures. They opened a laptop showing flag billing codes, hundreds of duplicate charges, inflated equipment costs, kickback patterns traced to medical supply companies over an 18-month window. The patterns were flagrant. The theft was systematic. And the forgery was the thing that would sink him completely. "When did you attempt to access and modify Master Chief Clarke's personnel records?" the lead agent asked, her voice flat as pavement. Caldwell had tried that morning. Tried to alter her file timestamps, erase her nursing credentials, create a digital trail proving she'd lied on her original application. He'd used his administrative access code at 7:52 a.m., 12 minutes after Hannah was escorted from the building. The IT department had flagged the anomaly immediately. The timestamps couldn't be changed retroactively without leaving evidence. Caldwell had left a signature on every alteration. His fingerprints were digital, but they were perfect. By 2:13 p.m., hospital security footage showed Dr. Caldwell attempting to delete files from his office computer. IT had locked his access 20 minutes earlier. He sat in front of the black screen, watching the cursor spin, understanding that the architecture of his deception had already been photographed and documented and sent upstream to federal prosecutors who were, at that very moment, building a RICO case against 6 physicians across the Portland medical system, all connected through his billing fraud scheme, all dependent on his network of kickbacks and inflated charges. At 3:45 p.m., federal agents in dark suits escorted Dr. Caldwell through the main lobby in handcuffs. His expensive Italian shoes, probably $2,000 new, clicked against linoleum as he walked. He walked past the vending machine where he'd mocked Hannah about her associate degree. The same vending machine. The same corridor. Nurses and orderlies lined the hallway in silence, watching. Watching a man who had tried to destroy a hero walk out in restraints. No one moved. No one spoke. The sound of his shoes on tile was the only noise. The perp walk lasted exactly 14 seconds. Hannah wasn't there to witness it. She was at the city police impound lot, arranging a tow for her dead Honda, still wearing blood-stained scrubs because she hadn't been allowed to return to her locker. Her phone, powered off since the moment Caldwell had walked her to HR, held 47 missed calls. She didn't check them. She couldn't process that her face was on national television, that her son David had been sitting in an army barracks when his unit chaplain came to tell him his mother was alive, that 8 years of perfect invisibility had shattered because she'd chosen to save a life instead of following protocol. The FBI audit expanded exponentially. 6 physicians. $2.3 million in kickbacks. 18 months of systematic billing fraud. Caldwell's attorney arrived at 5:10 p.m., too late to prevent what had already been documented. By 6:38 p.m., news cameras filled the hospital parking lot. Reporters were broadcasting live about the hero nurse fired for saving a life, the Master Chief Petty Officer whose service had been classified until the moment she broke protocol to perform emergency cardiac massage. At 7:22 p.m., the hospital board released a statement requesting Hannah's immediate return, full reinstatement, and a formal apology that would mean nothing because institutional apologies never did. Hannah was standing in her apartment staring at the combat boots she'd finally brought home from her locker, the boots she'd hidden for 8 years, the only physical proof of who she actually was. She wondered if she would ever feel like a real person again, or if she'd always be divided into the woman who saved lives and the ghost who wasn't supposed to exist. 2 months later, someone mentioned to Hannah that Dr. Caldwell was teaching CPR certification classes at a community college for minimum wage while awaiting trial. His medical license was suspended. His assets were frozen. His career had been incinerated in 48 hours by his own incompetence and arrogance. She heard this news while standing in a corridor at the White House, waiting to enter a room where the President of the United States was preparing to pin a Navy cross on her uniform. The Oval Office at 2:13 p.m., Hannah stood in dress whites for the first time in 8 years, the fabric strange against her skin. The uniform was pristine. The ribbons were perfect. And her hands were steady. Always steady. The President entered with the Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Naval Operations, and her son David in his army dress uniform, eyes red from crying, standing at attention with the kind of rigid composure that came from military families who understood that some moments transcended words. David held her worn combat boots under his arm. The same boots. The MacGuffin object that had spent 8 years hidden in a locker, waiting for this moment. The boots that proved she was real, that her service mattered, that she had existed in places most people would never comprehend. The President spoke briefly about service, about sacrifice, about the operators who serve in silence and return to lives where nobody knows what they've done. Then he pinned the Navy cross above her ribbons. The medal caught the light. The cameras documented what had been classified for nearly a decade. David stepped forward and embraced his mother for the first time since learning she was alive, the boots pressed between them like the most important thing in the world. Later, in a quiet corridor away from press and officials, a young Navy corpsman approached Hannah nervously. He was 23 years old and deploying next month. His hands trembled slightly when he spoke. "Master Chief, how do you keep going when nobody knows what you've done?" Hannah looked at the boots David was still holding. The leather was worn. The laces were frayed. They'd walked through deserts and mountains and villages where the rules of the world didn't apply. She looked back at the corpsman and spoke with the kind of calm that only came from having already survived the worst. "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." The corpsman nodded, understanding something that words couldn't quite capture. And then Hannah walked back toward the ceremony, back toward the lights and the cameras and the moment when her 8 years of invisibility finally ended. Back toward a life where people would know her name. Back toward being real. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.